Our little hero is running around in our world with the time ticking. But unless you're debugging the game from within the Godot editor, there's no way of knowing what day or time it is in the game. This is what we'll be fixing today. In this video, we will create a GUI that displays the in-game time, so the player knows what's going on. To follow along, you need to already have made a functional in-game time system. If you need help with this, then go check out the first 2 episodes of this series on how to make an in-game time system in Godot. And now, let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we need is some art to create our GUI with. So far in this series, we've been using some of all the amazing and free art from Kenny. But for this episode, I've made a few new assets myself that can be used together with the art from Kenny. You can find these on itch.io. I've left a link in the description. I've included assets for more than one style of GUI. In this video, we will just be using one of them, but the itch page has examples of 2 styles. I've already downloaded the art and imported it into my project. So go ahead and do the same before moving on. Our in-game time system has a lot of information. We have the number of days, and then we have hours, minutes, and seconds within the current day. If you solve some of the exercises from the last episode, then you might also have the week number, the month, and the year. But we don't necessarily want to show all the information all the time. I think I will take inspiration from Stardew Valley and some of the similar games. So I will show what day it is, and then I will show an analog clock with the hours and minutes. But feel free to expand this as you like. Now let's create a new scene for our time GUI and use a control node as the root node. Control nodes are useful UI items because we can anchor their position relative to their parent control. I've left a link in the description to where in the Godot documentation you can read more about the control node. Okay, so in our new time GUI scene, I will then add 2 new control nodes as the children of the root node. And then rename these to DayControl and ClockControl. We'll then be placing the items for displaying the day under the DayControl and the items for displaying the clock under the ClockControl. But before we do any of this, let's first add a background to our time GUI. We will be using a NinePatchRect for this. These are also a type of control node, so I guess we could have used this as the root node, but I prefer to just add it like this. We can use this NinePatchRect to create a panel of almost any size based on just a small texture. Let's see what that means. First, let's add the time GUI art to the NinePatchRect. You can do this by just clicking and dragging the art onto the node. Okay, so we don't want to use the whole texture here. Only this 16 by 16 part at the top left. So let's start by editing the NinePatchRect's region rect from the inspector menu. The X and Y here is the position where the part of the texture we want to use starts. These should just stay at 0. And then below, we have to set the width and the height of the part of the texture we want. So we'll set these to 16. Now we only have the small part of the texture that we want to use. We can try to scale the NinePatchRect now to see what happens. Well, this just behaves like a normal sprite, but this isn't what we want. Instead, we can go back to the inspector menu and set the patch margins. These will then be used to split the texture into a 3x3 grid. For the texture I created, we should set all the patch margins to 7. Other textures might need different patch margins. It all depends on the design. Now when we scale our NinePatchRect, the corners remain unchanged. The center is scaled normally, and the edges are only scaled or tiled, either horizontally or vertically, depending on the edge. This creates a nice background for our time GUI, which we can easily scale to fit our needs. Now we're ready to work on how we will display the current day. Remember that we will be placing the visuals for this under the DayControl node. To make it easier to create, I will first start by hiding the background and the ClockControl, and then select DayControl. Okay, so in this video, I just have an accumulation of the days, so no weeks or weekdays. This is something you can try to add for yourself later. Or maybe you already have added it if you solved the exercises for the last episode in the series. Yeah, so I need a label to display the day number. Godot has 2 options we can use: the simple label node and the more complex rich text label. You can read more about these in the documentation, but for now, I will just use the simple label node. In the Labels text field in the Inspector menu, I start by writing 999 so we can test how the text will look in the game. Now, this style definitely isn't what I'm going for. So the first thing we will want to change is the font type and the font color. There are a few ways we could do this here. In the Inspector menu, we can go down to Layout, and then we could either edit the theme or the theme overrides. If we had more UI items, I might create a new theme. But for this simple UI, where all we're using is a few labels, I will instead be creating a new label setting. To create a new label setting, we click where it says Empty next to the Label Settings property, and then click New Label Settings. Here we can then open the font settings, from where we can set the font and its color. I've already downloaded the Kenny Mini Square font and added it to my project. This is part of the Kenny Fonts pack, and I've left a link in the description to where you can find it. Okay, so to add the font, we then just click and drag it from the File System menu and onto where it says Empty next to the font. To set the font color, we can then just click the color next to where it says Color and choose the color. You can choose whatever color you want. But remember that it's also really easy to change this later on. So don't think too long about the color right now. For my project, I'm choosing the darkest color from the NinePatchRect texture using the little color picker tool here. Finally, we need to remember to save our new label settings, so it's easy to add to another label later on. So click the little down arrow next to the settings and select Save As. Before we move on from the label we want to use to display the day, we should also change the size of the label so it fits as tightly as possible around the text. Here it's important that you've thought about what the maximum number of digits you want to display is, so there's room enough for all of them. This is also why my test text has 3 digits and that I'm using 9s instead of 1s. You should also think about the horizontal alignment. Do you want the number to grow to the left or the right or from the center? I want my number to grow to the left, so it needs to be aligned to the right. You can also try to change the text to get a feeling of what the alignment will look like. Okay, now we have our text, but I feel that a small icon to the left would look nice. It should give a hint to what the number is. So I've created a small sun icon we can use for this. To add it, we create a sprite and add the time GUI texture to it. Again, we need to set the region rect to get the correct part of the texture. So in the inspector menu, open region and click to enable. As previously, we can define the region rect using X, Y, W and H. Or we can click the edit region for a click and drag option. Now that we have our little sun, we just need to position the sun and the label correctly next to each other. This might also be something you would go back and change later on, once everything in our GUI is done. But for now, I'm just placing the sun all the way to the left, and then leave a little space before the label. I'm also trying to make it so the text is vertically centered to the sun. Finally, we need to set the size of the DayControl node so it fits nicely around the sun and the label. And now we're ready to move on to the ClockControl. This is built in a very similar manner. So let's first hide the DayControl and show the ClockControl. For our ClockControl, we need 3 labels. One to display the hour, one for the minutes, and one for a colon between the two. First, let's make sure they are all using the label settings we created earlier. So locate the settings in the File System menu and click and drag it onto each of the labels. Next, we will want to change the size of each label and then position them correctly next to each other. Oh, and now might also be a good time to give each label a meaningful name. I'm not changing the alignment for these labels because I want this to look like a proper digital clock. So I will be adding leading zeros to numbers less than 10. Again, I also want a small icon that hints at what these numbers are. This time, I made a small hourglass icon we can use. We add this just like we added the sun to the DayControl. And finally, I move things around a bit until everything is nicely positioned. Remember to also set the size of the ClockControl at the end. Now, let's display all our GUI elements again and move them around a bit. To avoid moving things inside each control, we can lock all our labels and sprites by selecting them and then clicking this little lock up here. We can now experiment with the size of the background and the position of each of the control nodes. As a small final thing, I also want to add a little background behind the clock items, and I'm doing this with a new NinePatchRect. But this time, I'm using this part of the texture. We can then move the clock control so it becomes a child of this new background node. And then we can use the clock control's anchor to position it directly in the middle of the background by choosing Layout, and then setting the layout mode to anchor, and finally setting the anchors preset to center. And well, the sun might also benefit from a background, but this time I will just use a sprite and add it behind the sun. And now we have the visuals of the GUI all set up. Remember to make sure the size of the time GUI root node matches the actual size of the GUI. And now let's save the scene and add our new time GUI to our world scene. To make sure that the GUI is always placed on top of our game, we need to have it added as a child of a canvas layer. So make sure you have this added to your world. Now we can use anchors to position the GUI nicely on top of the game. The final thing we need to do is connect our GUI with our time system and make it update correctly. We really only need to update the GUI every 1 in-game minute. But if we set ticks per second really high, we might not be able to update every in-game minute. So our best option is to update the time GUI every time the time system updates the in-game time. The first step into doing this is to create an updated signal in the time system class that emits right after its date time is updated, and then sends the date time with the signal. Next, we need to first create a script for the time GUI and connect the time system's updated signal with this new script. We can do this using the node menu and at the same time create the method in our GUI script that the signal will be connected to. In our time GUI script, we then first need to create a reference for all the labels we want to be able to update. So the day label, the hour label, and the minutes label. Okay, now let's update the text of each of the labels. At first, we can just set the text of each label to the corresponding part of the datetime object. And then let's test and see what happens. Well, this looks alright, but the digital clock is missing the leading zeros. So let's go back to the script and create a new method for adding these. This method takes a label and a value as input. Then it checks if the value is less than 10. And if this is the case, it adds a 0 to the label text. We also create a new method for updating a label. This will take a label and a value as input, and also a boolean stating if there should be a leading 0 or not. In this method, we then first set the label text to be empty. Then we call the add leading 0 if should have 0 is true. And finally, it adds value to the text. We then call this method from the update method for each of the labels. And here the value is the corresponding time value from a datetime object. Now let's test again and enjoy the result. I've uploaded a few exercises for all paying members on YouTube and Patreon. You can use these to dig deeper into the topics we've explored in this video. And that was all for this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell and all that if you want to see more content like this. Bye!